Why have a belief as to whether or not global warming is real or not real?
Because
if
I just find that when things,
you don't understand the science.
You are correct.
2:30 in the morning, up out of my brain, right? Now I have to go to my landlord.
Like, there's things that you said that I believe that I don't, that I've never said that I do.
Joe Rogan built his entire empire on one thing: curiosity. For years, people tuned in because he felt different from everyone else. He wasn't a polished news anchor. He wasn't reading from a script. He wasn't trying to protect a brand. He was just a guy asking questions. One day, he'd be talking to a scientist about the universe.
Show me a real picture.
Listen, NASA does not have one of those satellites.
Fake.
Why does it look fake?
It looks like something you'd see in a movie.
The next, he'd be laughing with comedians.
2:30 in the morning, up out of my brain, right? Now I have to go to my landlord.
Then suddenly, he'd be deep into conspiracies.
Is there a photo of this flat Earth?
No, I don't. Like I just said again.
That's what I asked.
There's
Psychedelics, MMA, politics, aliens, health, free speech, anything. And that was the magic. Nothing felt off limits. But somewhere along the way, the show changed. The same guy who used to question powerful people is now sitting across from billionaires and barely pushing back. The same guy who warned people about corporate media is now accused of sounding more like it. And the same audience that once saw him as independent is now starting to wonder if he's become too rich, too insulated, and too close to the people he used to challenge. This didn't happen overnight. It happened through a series of decisions, each one small at first, but together they changed everything. And the first one came with the biggest payday of his life. In 2020, Spotify offered Joe Rogan a deal that completely changed the trajectory of his career. Reportedly worth around $100 million at the time, it wasn't just a podcast contract, it was a statement. Spotify wanted the Joe Rogan Experience badly enough to lock it behind their platform, and Joe accepted. At first, most fans understood why. It was generational money, the kind of deal almost nobody turns down. And for a while, it looked like a massive win for everyone involved. But then people started noticing something strange. Episodes were disappearing. Not one or two random uploads. Entire conversations vanished from the catalog. Old episodes with controversial comedians, conspiracy theorists, and politically sensitive guests suddenly weren't available anymore. And that immediately triggered alarm bells. Because one of the biggest reasons people loved Rogan in the first place was that nothing felt censored. Whether the guest was brilliant, insane, hilarious, or completely wrong didn't matter. Joe would still sit there for 3 hours and let the conversation happen. That unpredictability was the entire appeal. So when episodes started getting removed after the Spotify move, fans saw it as the beginning of corporate influence creeping into the show. Joe pushed back against that narrative hard. He insisted Spotify wasn't controlling him.
Oh my God, Spotify's censoring Rogan, Spotify's doing this.
It's not happening.
Spotify has said nothing.
Said nobody was telling him what he could or couldn't say.
They haven't said anything to me. In terms of like them silencing me, zero.
And technically, maybe that was true. But perception matters. And to longtime viewers, the timing felt impossible to ignore. The underground podcast that once felt raw and untouchable now had a giant corporation attached to it. And even if Joe himself didn't change immediately, the feeling around the show did. Not long after the Spotify deal, Joe Rogan made another decision that completely changed the atmosphere of the show.
What's the story? You moving?
I'm out of here. Yeah.
When do you leave?
Soon.
He left Los Angeles and moved to Austin.
Yeah, I'm going to go to Texas. I just want to go somewhere in the center of the country, somewhere it's easier to travel to both places, and somewhere where you have a little bit more freedom.
At the time, it sounded reasonable. The pandemic had turned LA into chaos. Lockdowns, rising homelessness, political tension, endless restrictions. Joe openly talked about feeling trapped there.
Also, I think that where we live right here in Los Angeles is overcrowded.
Texas represented the opposite. More freedom, lower taxes, and a fresh start. And to a lot of fans, it felt like classic Rogan. A guy rejecting the system and doing his own thing. But looking back, that move changed far more than just his address. Because Los Angeles gave Joe something people underestimated: access. The old JRE worked because literally everyone passed through LA. Scientists, actors, comics, directors, athletes, authors, conspiracy theorists, journalists. Joe could pull from an endless pool of interesting people. That's why older episodes felt so unpredictable. You never knew what kind of conversation you were about to get. But once he moved to Austin, the variety slowly narrowed. The show became more centered around the same circles: comedians, political commentators, tech people, culture war personalities, and friends already inside the Rogan orbit. And then came the Comedy Mothership. Joe didn't just move to Texas. He started building an entire ecosystem around himself there. Comics followed him. Podcasters followed him. Austin slowly became a new hub built around Rogan's influence. But with that came another problem: echo chambers. Because when the same people keep talking to each other over and over again, eventually the conversations start sounding the same. And fans started noticing it. When Joe Rogan opened the Comedy Mothership in Austin, it was supposed to represent freedom for comedians. No corporate pressure, no cancel culture, no Hollywood executives telling comics what they could joke about. And at first, people loved the idea. A comedy club built by a comedian sounded authentic, especially coming from Joe, who had spent decades talking about stand-up like it was a sacred art form. But over time, the Mothership started getting a very specific reputation. Instead of feeling like a place where all comedy styles thrived, critics began describing it as an anti-woke bubble. A scene built less around being genuinely funny and more around reacting against political correctness. And that's where things started getting weird, because the free speech comedy angle slowly became the entire identity. Every conversation circled back to the same topics: cancel culture, woke audiences, offensive jokes, censorship, trans jokes, culture war stuff, over and over again. For some fans, it stopped feeling rebellious. It started feeling repetitive. Even comedians began quietly criticizing the atmosphere around Austin comedy. Some said the scene felt overly cliquey.
The thing with Joe, he's created a sort of army of people that think they know comedy, but they only know a specific thing.
Others implied Rogan's influence had become so massive that nobody wanted to openly disagree with him. And that created another strange shift. Joe Rogan wasn't just a podcaster anymore. He had become a gatekeeper. Young comics wanted his approval because appearing in the Rogan sphere could completely change their careers overnight. A single podcast appearance could sell out tours, explode social media followings, and launch people into mainstream success. That kind of power changes the dynamic around a person. Suddenly, fewer people challenge you honestly. And the more insulated Joe became inside that Austin circle, the more disconnected the show started feeling from the chaotic unpredictability that made it special in the first place. But the real turning point came when Joe tried reminding everyone that he was still a stand-up comedian first. Because that's when the audience started asking an uncomfortable question. Was he ever actually that funny? In 2024, Joe Rogan released his Netflix comedy special, Burn the Boats. And instead of reminding people why he belonged among comedy's elite, it did the exact opposite. For years, Joe had talked about stand-up comedy like it was one of the hardest crafts on earth. He constantly described comedians as modern philosophers, people who understood timing, structure, pressure, and human psychology better than almost anyone else. He spoke about comedy with the intensity of someone discussing brain surgery. So naturally, expectations were high, especially because Joe claimed this special was material he had been refining for years. But once it dropped, the reaction online was brutal. A lot of viewers weren't just disappointed. They were confused. The jokes felt underdeveloped. The punchlines often didn't land. And many moments came across less like comedy and more like political ranting mixed with yelling. That's when an old criticism of Rogan exploded back into the mainstream. People respected Joe Rogan, the podcaster, far more than Joe Rogan, the comedian. And suddenly, clips from the special were everywhere. Awkward pauses, silent crowds, forced energy. People started mocking the way he screamed mid-joke to make bits feel bigger than they actually were. Even longtime fans struggled defending it. Because for years, Joe had positioned himself as one of the guardians of stand-up comedy. Someone who deeply understood the art form. Someone who could recognize greatness instantly. But now viewers were asking, If Joe is one of the greatest comedians alive, why doesn't his material sound anywhere near the level of the comics he praises? And that question hurt his image badly, because once people started doubting his authority in comedy, they started reevaluating everything else too, especially his politics. For most of his career, Joe Rogan was seen as politically unpredictable. That was a huge part of his appeal. One episode, he'd criticize the left. The next, he'd criticize the right. He supported things like gay marriage and psychedelics while also defending gun rights and questioning government power. People didn't watch Joe because they thought he belonged to one side. They watched him because he didn't. But around the 2024 election cycle, that perception started collapsing. The podcast became increasingly political, and more importantly, it stopped feeling balanced to a lot of viewers. The guest list shifted heavily toward political commentators, culture war personalities, billionaires, and people closely tied to right-wing internet spaces. And when major political figures started appearing on the show, the atmosphere changed completely, especially after Donald Trump appeared on the podcast. That interview was massive. Millions of people saw it as a defining cultural moment. But critics argued Joe wasn't really challenging Trump. He was giving him one of the biggest platforms in media history to freely present himself to voters. And then Joe endorsed him. That's the moment where a lot of longtime viewers mentally separated the old Joe from the new one. Because suddenly, the guy who always insisted he was politically homeless looked like he had fully picked a side. And once that happened, every conversation started getting interpreted differently. If Joe questioned mainstream media, people saw it as partisan. If he criticized Democrats, people saw it as partisan. Even when he tried acting neutral afterward, the perception had already shifted. The podcast no longer felt like a weird, curiosity-driven show exploring ideas from every angle. To many viewers, it now felt like a politically aligned platform with a very clear audience. And the more political it became, the less room there was for the old, unpredictable magic that made JRE feel special. The old Joe Rogan built his reputation by distrusting powerful people. That was literally the brand. Question the government, question corporations, question media narratives, question billionaires, question pharmaceutical companies, question intelligence agencies, question everything. But over the last few years, something flipped. Instead of challenging powerful people, Joe started sounding strangely comfortable around them, especially billionaires. At first, fans thought it was cool seeing major tech figures on the show. These were conversations nobody else could get access to. But eventually, viewers started noticing that Joe treated certain guests completely differently from everyone else. The best example was probably Peter Thiel. Now, Peter Thiel isn't just some random rich guy. He co-founded PayPal, funded massive tech companies, invested heavily in surveillance technology, worked closely with intelligence circles, and helped build Palantir Technologies, a company deeply tied to government data analysis and military operations. This should have been one of the most intense interviews in JRE history. Old Joe Rogan would have spent hours questioning the ethics of surveillance, government control, data collection, intelligence agencies, censorship, military contracts, all of it. Instead, almost none of that happened. The conversation stayed weirdly soft, and fans immediately noticed, because this wasn't the Joe Rogan who used to grill guests about corruption or hidden power structures. This was a Joe Rogan who looked fascinated by elite tech billionaires and eager to hear their worldview. The same thing happened with other guests too. More and more episodes started feeling like networking sessions between wealthy, influential people instead of chaotic conversations exploring uncomfortable truths. And whenever someone later questioned those billionaires, Joe often sounded defensive. That completely confused longtime fans, because the guy who once warned people about elites now seemed convinced that his billionaire friends were the good ones. But the biggest warning sign came when Joe stopped questioning technology itself, especially AI. At this point, one of the strangest transformations in Joe Rogan's career is how obsessed he's become with AI, and not in a cautious way, in an almost spiritual way. This is the same guy who used to question every institution on Earth. The same guy who spent years warning people about manipulation, propaganda, surveillance, and powerful corporations controlling narratives. But when it comes to artificial intelligence, Joe suddenly sounds unbelievably trusting. There have been multiple moments where he confidently repeated obviously fake AI-generated content on the podcast. Fake videos, fake clips, misleading AI summaries. It keeps happening. And instead of becoming more skeptical after getting fooled, he often doubles down. That's what makes longtime viewers uncomfortable. Because old Joe Rogan treated technology carefully. He understood that powerful systems could manipulate people. But now he talks about AI like it's some inevitable God-level force humanity should simply accept. Sometimes he even sounds excited about it replacing people. And the weirdest part is how AI has slowly started replacing the human element of the show itself. Back in the older JRE days, Jamie would constantly pull up articles, sources, studies, interviews, random clips, real-time fact-checking that grounded conversations in reality. Now, Joe increasingly leans on AI tools instead, and fans have noticed the shift. The podcast feels less curious and more automated, less human and more algorithmic. Even the conversations themselves have changed. Joe has spent entire episodes forcing guests to listen to AI-generated music covers, praising AI-generated voices, and talking about artificial intelligence like it could become humanity's next evolutionary stage. At one point, he even entertained the idea that AI could essentially become a form of Jesus Christ. That sounds insane to older fans because the old Rogan distrusted centralized power. But modern AI represents the ultimate centralized power. Governments, corporations, and tech elites controlling information, communication, entertainment, labor, surveillance, and eventually reality itself. Yet Joe rarely pushes back against that possibility anymore. Instead, he often sounds like someone trying to emotionally prepare the audience to accept it. And for many viewers, that's the moment the illusion completely shattered. Because the guy who once questioned the future now sounds like he's submitting to it. What makes all of this so fascinating is that Joe Rogan didn't suddenly become irrelevant. He became too powerful. That's the real story. The old Joe Rogan felt relatable because he seemed like a normal guy, accidentally sitting in front of extraordinary people. He asked dumb questions sometimes. He got things wrong. He laughed at ridiculous theories. He changed his mind publicly. That authenticity made people trust him. But once the podcast became one of the biggest media platforms on Earth, everything around him changed. The guests became more powerful. The money became bigger. The stakes became higher. And somewhere along the way, Joe stopped sounding like a guy exploring ideas and started sounding like someone protecting access to elite circles. That's why so many older fans feel disconnected now. It isn't just politics. It isn't just Spotify. It isn't just the billionaires or the AI obsession or the Austin echo chamber. It's the feeling that the curiosity disappeared. Old JRE felt unpredictable because Joe genuinely seemed open to being surprised. Modern JRE often feels like Joe already knows which narratives he believes and which ones he immediately dismisses. And the irony is brutal. The guy who built his empire criticizing mainstream media slowly became a new version of it. Wealthy, influential, politically connected, defensive of powerful people, and increasingly disconnected from regular audiences. Even moments with comedians like Theo highlight this shift perfectly. Theo still throws out weird thoughts, conspiracies, uncomfortable questions, and chaotic observations the way old Rogan guests used to. But instead of leaning into the chaos, Joe often shuts it down. That's the part longtime viewers notice most. The old Joe Rogan would have been fascinated by the modern Joe Rogan. The current version often sounds annoyed by the very kind of curiosity that made his show explode in the first place. At the end of the day, Joe Rogan is still massively successful. The podcast is still enormous. Millions of people still watch every episode. Comedians still orbit around him. Politicians still want his endorsement. Billionaires still want access to his audience. Financially, socially, culturally, Joe already won. But that's exactly why this transformation feels so strange to longtime fans. Because the Joe Rogan people originally connected with wasn't supposed to become another powerful media figure protecting elite interests. He was supposed to be the guy questioning all of it from the outside. And maybe that's impossible once someone reaches his level of influence. Maybe nobody stays fully independent after becoming this rich, this connected, and this politically valuable. That's what makes his story so interesting. Joe Rogan didn't collapse overnight. He slowly drifted away from the exact mindset that made people trust him in the first place. The curiosity turned into certainty. The skepticism turned selective. And the outsider slowly became part of the establishment he once mocked. Now, whether fans continue walking away or eventually reconnect with the show depends on one thing. Can Joe Rogan still question the powerful when he's become one of them himself? If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next deep dive. We break down the rise, downfall, and hidden transformations of the internet's biggest personalities every single week. And trust me, the next story gets even crazier.